What if you had a guide who could tell you how to bridge a gap between who you are today and who you're destined to be? What if each week you could hear a story of someone who has tried and succeeded, or perhaps tried and failed, but learned something in the process? Limitless Spirit is a weekly podcast where host Helen Todd interviews guests about topics and personal stories on defining life's purpose, pursuing personal growth, and developing a deeper faith in Christ.
By that time, my husband had taken over my son. So he would actually teach my son, who was barely a year at that time, how to slap me and hit me and spit at me and treat me the way I deserved to be treated. And it was so hard watching my toddler becoming like his dad. And then I found out I was pregnant again. So my hope was to have the baby die so that at least another baby wouldn't come into this situation. When the doctors told me that the baby was not going to make it, I felt so guilty that it was all my fault. And it was all because of me. And I decided that the only way that I was ever going to be happy again, and the whole world would be happy, was if I was out of this world and if I took my life.
Have you ever experienced a moment so dark that it made you question whether God cares or whether He even exists? Welcome to the Limitless Spirit Podcast. I'm your host, Helen Todd. My guest on this episode is Colette Pella, a family support coordinator for a program called Motherwise. She's passionate about helping pregnant women, young mothers, and domestic abuse survivors to survive and thrive through difficult circumstances. Her passion comes from her own personal experience and the testimony of redemption from domestic abuse, alcohol abuse, and severe depression. In our conversation, you will hear how Colette began to witness physical abuse in her home at the age of 4, how she became dependent on alcohol in elementary school, and how God saved her from suicide in the midst of an abusive marriage. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. Hello, Colette. Welcome to the Limitless Spirit Podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thanks to see you, Helen.
Well, it's been a few months since we've seen each other, and we met on a mission trip to the Republic of Georgia. This was the first time I got to know you, and I was really amazed at how well you connected with the kids during this trip. It seemed like they were just drawn to you, and you had this ability to make them excited and curious. And so that, of course, probably stems from your profession, being in social work. And so my question is, what caused you to go into that profession?
Yes. First of all, I love children. You're absolutely right. And I've loved just being with children all my life. I've loved seeing them grow up and watching them change and all the developmental milestones that they go through. And I first started in early education. So I was actually an early childhood elementary education teacher for many years. And through that experience actually is what drew me to social work. I found out that I love not only spending time with the kids, but also their parents. And when I heard some of their stories and how difficult their life was, I realized that more needed to be done for these families that I was teaching the children. And I started helping out the families by some needed employment, some needed just tangible resources like food and a place to sleep for the night and things like that. And so through that experience, I really started seeing how valuable it was to help families. And that's what drew me to social work, so that I had the opportunity to work with the whole family and not just the kids for a short amount of time in my classroom.
During that mission trip, I got to hear your testimony, and I want us to talk a little about that. But do you think that the painful experiences that you have gone through in your childhood have something to do with that calling in your life?
Absolutely, I do. Because I didn't really have that nurturing environment or an adult in my world that really cared for me and could speak into my life positive things, that I really wanted to become that adult for other children. And that's what I did as a teacher and now as a social worker. The importance of that is so important. And currently I'm working with moms, helping them to be better moms, to speak that into their children's lives as well.
Well, your story really fits perfectly into our series, Change Lives, Change Lives. So let's talk about your childhood and how you got from where you were then to where you are now.
Sure. My childhood was a very difficult one. To back it up, my parents were very young, and they also did not have good nurturing role models for themselves. So it was very difficult when they became parents to really take care of a baby. And so I think that's where it all began for me. And part of my healing journey is really understanding that they were not abusive on purpose, so to speak, but that they just didn't know how to be good parents. And that's what led them to make poor choices that they did. As I said, they were very young when they got married. They both rebelled. Both of their parents did not want them to marry the other one. So it was really a Romeo Juliet kind of start place for them. And so they ran away to get married because they were too young to get married in the state of Colorado. So they actually went to another state to get married. I came a year later. I was born a year later, and at that time, my dad was traveling a lot, so it was just my mom and myself. And again, as a single mom with not a lot of experience, she had a lot of difficulties. And looking backwards in time, again, I think there was a lot of postpartum that she went through that we didn't know anything about back then, and she just suffered silently through it. But I remember her telling stories of even when I was a baby, that it was really hard to get me to stop crying, or so they would feed me all the time. So I was a very chunky baby. I had a lot of bottles. That was the only way to keep me quiet. And as I became a toddler, it was a lot of food and cookies and anything to keep me quiet. So my mom's main role was to keep me quiet. When my dad did come back on the weekends, there was more pressure to keep me quiet because he just wanted a restful weekend. He was out on the road as a salesman. He really didn't like a crying baby hanging around. So I think there was more pressure on my mom early on to keep me even more quiet as a baby so that I wouldn't upset my father. As a 4 and 5-year-old, I started probably witnessing the domestic violence between my parents. It was going on before that, but I was much too young to be in the same room when it was happening. So they would move me to another room. But at 4 and 5, I was moving around and following them because I was very worried about what was happening to my mother. And so my dad got very violent when he drank and very abusive. And it was very common for him to drag my mother by her hair and throw her against the wall, punch her, slap her, hit her. I mean, lots of violence. And as a young child at 4.5, I remember trying to stop those fights a lot. And of course, I would get thrown back out of the way and he would continue beating on my mom. Once it was finished, he would retire. He'd either pass out somewhere in the bedroom or on the couch. And I would go tend to my mother because my mother was either very bloody or beat up or couldn't move. And I remember definitely helping her with not even having any strength as a 4-year-old, but helping her to bed, cleaning up her wounds as much as I could.
At 4 years old.
At 4 years old.
Goodness.
Yes. There was no one else in the house to do it. My baby brother came the following year. And it became my primary responsibility to take care of him. So my mom would feed him and change him. But as I said, she got more and more depressed. And so she had a really hard delivery with him. And I think that really started, again, another bout of postpartum depression for her. But again, undiagnosed. So I remember her, the baby crying and crying and crying. And I would, tell her, Mom, you got to wake up and feed the baby. He's hungry. And this was at 5 now. And my mom would be, I'm too tired. You're going to have to do it. And so I was taught how to make a formula bottle. Back then it was the old pet milk and water, so we didn't have so much mixing and formula to make, but I had to put a tablespoon of Karo syrup. I remember putting a can of the milk in his bottle and mixing it up with water, and that was my job to get his bottles ready. So while my mom slept or also started drinking at this time, slept it off, I took care of my brother. So I learned how to change diapers. I learned how to feed him. I learned how to keep him quiet, how to play with him. And I must say, and I confess, and this is probably not a great thing to hear, but I really started to hate my little brother. He complicated my life so much in my mind. And again, as a 5-year-old, I didn't really comprehend all of that. But my only solace was going to school, because then I got out of the house. So in school, I loved it. I loved to play, and I had a good time with the other children. And then I'd have to come home and take care of my brother, because by then my mom was ready to take a nap. And then my dad would come home shortly after and start yelling about something, and he'd end up hitting my mother again. So then it became my job to take care of my brother.
I'm assuming your parents were not believers and didn't have faith in their life.
No, interesting. My mom was raised in an Assembly of God's church. My dad was raised Catholic. So she actually converted to marry him as a Catholic. And my dad never went to church with us. My mom took us to Catholic church every Sunday, but my dad never did go to church with us. Most of the time he was either drunk or hungover, so he wasn't in a place to go. But the faith for her, that Catholic church of just being close to God and being in a church, was very important to her. So she would take me and then later on my brother to Catholic church every Sunday. So that we were raised in that regards. I was sent to a Catholic school in first grade. And so my mom really wanted us to have a relationship with God. That was very important to her. And I think it paid off much later in life for me. But initially, that was really her hope. And for her, she felt that was going through the Catholic Church at the time.
And so eventually you became addicted to alcohol as well. How old were you?
Yeah, at age 9, I just started to check out. I was tired of the responsibilities. I was tired of watching my dad beat up my mother. I was tired of crying out to God, because I started praying at that time too for God to change my dad. And I really believed he would. And my dad did not change at the time. And that made me more disillusioned with God. And the alcohol was always in our house, always available, everywhere you could find it. So I just started sneaking a bottle here and a bottle there. And before you know it, I realized why they liked it, because it did take the pain away. It numbed my memories. It numbed my pain. I didn't have to worry about it. By 9, I was starting to get hit by my dad as well, because he did not like how sassy I had become. So he wanted to silence me and make sure I wasn't in trouble. Later on in life is how he put it. And so that was his way of training me to be a good wife, was to be quiet and submissive. So I just drank a lot at 9, and I started smoking cigarettes about that time as well, and just checking out. I didn't want any responsibility. I just became a really wild child, and I really did enjoy the alcohol, and I drank every day at that time. And by the time I was 15, I was an alcoholic. And I absolutely had to have alcohol to make it through the day. I remember hiding vodka in my locker in high school and hiding it in a water bottle where no one would ever search it or find it. But I was just talking to a friend about, I got kicked out of chemistry class in high school because the teacher was afraid that I would drink the alcohol out of the alcohol Bunsen burners that we used. And he was probably right. I would have gotten so desperate at that time. I needed to have a drink of alcohol.
So were there any people in your life at that time that tried to help, that noticed that there was a problem?
There were a couple of my teachers that were aware that my behavior had changed, because I got very rebellious in class. Because up to that point, school was my safe zone. So anytime I was at school, I felt like I could be good and happy, and at home I really became more rebellious and didn't listen to any of my parents or checked out on my brother as well. He was 5 years younger than me, so that really made him 10 around that time. Then needed a big sister, but I just turned my back on him. I became full of hate at that time. I hated my dad. I hated my mother for not standing up to him and kicking him out. I hated my brother for constantly needing me and needing my attention. I hated myself. I really hated God at that time. I was more mad at God, I think, than anybody else, because I had grown up knowing that God did miracles and he could make things change, and he never did. So I felt very disappointed in him and very angry.
And so your teachers, they noticed that, but they were not able to help you.
Absolutely. I remember one sitting down with me and telling me that I needed to get help. And at that time, there were no alcohol rehab treatment programs for teenagers. And so I told her, where do I even begin? And she said, I don't know, but let me try to help you. And I remember I was helping her. I was an assistant for her for one of my classes. And I stopped going to her class and I stopped being her assistant because I didn't want to be helped at that time. I liked feeling miserable. I liked the anger and hatred in my heart. And I liked drinking my pain away.
And what about people in church? Did they not notice that there were problems?
No, because, when we went to church on Sundays, we were a good family. We looked good. No one ever knew. And my parents didn't even know the extent of my drinking at that time. They just knew I had become very rebellious and they didn't know why. Shortly after that, I met my first husband, and I was 17 when I met him, and he was pretty bad boy on the scene, and I thought he was very attractive because he was so much more badder than I was, and I really needed that. I needed to be around somebody with power. I started gravitating to him because he did have that power. He was starting to get involved with gangs, and he was very working his way up at that time, and really powerful. And so, the power I saw in my dad was always in a violent way, but I thought this power that my then boyfriend had was in a good way, that he could take care of me, he would protect me, and no one could ever hurt me again.
And so you got married, but things got worse.
Yes. He knew I had an alcohol problem, and he used that a lot. Like, if you want this drink, I remember many times him holding it out in front of me and saying, if you really want this, and this is what you have to do to get it, and would make me do horrible things so that I could have that drink in his hand. And this was my husband, or then boyfriend, protecting me, that I thought. The pressure of living in sin forced me to get married. And I told him, we got to get married because I can't continue living in sin. Now I know there's other choices, and that's what I help other girls figure out, that that's not your only choice to have to marry this person who's abusing you. But I got married and thought everything would change and he would love me, and all he needed was somebody like me to love him back. And it did not. It got worse. That's when he started getting very physical with me, and was way worse than anything I ever saw my dad do to my mom.
And so what caused you to realize that this is not the right person?
It took several years and 2 children later. We had our firstborn a year after we got married, and it became my job to keep my child quiet so that my husband was not disturbed. And anytime the baby would cry, I would get slapped. Anytime the baby would fuss and get really loud, I would get a punch in the stomach. So I quickly learned to keep my son quiet. And I understand more about what my mom did for me in those early years as well. And so I tried everything to keep my son quiet when my husband was home so that he wouldn't hit me. But then it became other things, like the house was dirty, the toys were on the floor, the food wasn't hot enough, the food wasn't good enough. And he just had more and more excuses to beat me because I was such a worthless person. I truly believed that for a long time, that I deserved every hit, every beating that I got, that I was a bad wife, I was a bad mother, because then he would tell me the baby was crying and that was my fault too. And so I just believed all the lies that he told me. And instead of turning the hate now, I started to turn it inside towards me, and I got very depressed and wanted to kill myself, and attempted a few times, but I remember trying to get a knife once and cut my artery. And of course, all I did was just get my arm, and I didn't really get anything done or accomplished that way, but a lot of pain. And so I realized that there must be better ways to handle this. And then I found out I was pregnant again. So with my second child, I was not allowed to go to the doctor because he would not allow me to see anybody outside of the home. And I told him I needed to see a doctor because I thought I was pregnant again. And he said we could not have another child, and so would kick me continuously in my stomach so that the baby would not survive. And I got more depressed and more depressed. And then at that time, he started withholding food. And so he thought I was getting too fat. And I told him, because I think I'm pregnant. And he said I needed to get skinny. And so he would give me an allotment of food per day that I was allowed to eat or not eat if I didn't want to. And he would portion it out so I would not gain any weight. And that, of course, put an impact on my baby developing inside of me. And so I snuck away one day while he was at work, and my mom and dad gave me some money to go see a doctor. And I went to the doctor and found out I was pregnant with my second child. At that time, the doctors informed me that it didn't look good. There was no heartbeat at that time. They did an ultrasound and could not find any movement. Pretty much told me this baby was not going to survive and sent me home. And I was so upset. I didn't know what to do because for, weeks I had been asking God to take this baby away from me because I didn't want another child. And by that time, my husband had taken over my son in the child raising because I was doing it so wrong. So he would actually teach my son, who was barely a year at that time, how to slap me and hit me and spit at me and treat me the way I deserved to be treated. And it was so hard watching my toddler becoming like his dad every day. And I just got more and more checked out. So my hope was to have the baby die so that at least another baby wouldn't come into this situation. When the doctors told me that the baby was not going to make it, I felt so guilty that it was all my fault. And it was all because of me. And I decided that the only way that I was ever going to be happy again, and the whole world would be happy, was if I was out of this world and if I took my life. So this time I seriously made a plan because I realized that the baby inside of me was dead. My son was no longer my son. My husband was some kind of demonic, horrible person he was just so violent and so mean that I didn't need to be around. He had totally distanced me from my parents. My parents, by this time, after the birth of my son, had both sobered up and were trying to reconcile with me and become a family again. So he shut that door. My brother, who also was reaching out to me at that time as a teenager, going through his own stuff, needing a big sister to help, he shut that door so that we could not come in contact with each other either. So he isolated me far away from everybody I knew and kept the power and control going. But I really missed my family, especially now. And I needed my family. I realized that they would be better off without me as well, because all they did was worry about my safety every time he would hit me or hurt me. And there was just no good answer except to kill myself. That was the only thing I could find as an answer. So I actually made a really great plan this time. We lived on the top of a bridge by the highways. And I figured if I jumped off that bridge, one of the cars would definitely run me over. So if I even survived that height jump off, I would definitely get killed by the cars constantly in motion down below. So it was a foolproof plan. I really thought it would work. It'd be successful. And I started walking that day, and I remember looking back at my son and seeing how awful it was to hear my husband telling him how to hate and how to be mean and how to be violent. And I realized I had to do this. And I walked over to the bridge, and I remember standing. First, I sat on the edge, just kind of looking at the cars down there below and knowing, yep, this will work. And I remember kind of swinging myself as I was sitting there. And then I started to stand up on the edge of the bridge, getting ready to jump. And I screamed at the top of my lungs, like, nobody loves me and nobody cares. So this is what I got to do. And I remember just as I put my arms back and ready to take the first jump off, I heard an audible voice, very loud and very clear, say, I love you and I care. I knew instantly that was the voice of God. I knew it in my heart. I knew it in my mind. I knew it in my soul. And I remember screaming back out to him and saying, if you are God and you do love me, then you better prove it. And you need to fix this baby inside of me. And if you do that, I will believe that you love me and that you care for me. And if you do that for me, I will show you how much I love you back, and I will serve you every day of my life. And I remember giving God a chance. I remember the story of Gideon and fleecing, and I remember thinking that was such a bad thing to do, to tell God what to do. But I needed the proof. I needed something to really say it was worth living another day. And so I got off the bridge, walked slowly back to the house, went inside, and the first thing my husband did was confront me and said, why are you here still? Like he knew my plan, like he knew what was going to happen. And I know that was the enemy. I know that was not him understanding that, because he had no idea what I was going to do. And I remember just shouting back at him and saying, I'm giving God a chance. And I remember going to bed and crying. The next morning, I had a doctor's appointment by chance, went in to see the doctors, and they actually found a heartbeat. They did not know why or how or what was going on. And so I remember them trying 5 fetal monitors because they thought it was a malfunction in their equipment. And they found a strong heartbeat. And then they put me on the ultrasound machine, and they could not believe what they were seeing. And there was a baby moving inside of me. And I knew God fixed my baby. The first thing the doctors told me, however, was, oh, don't get your hopes up. We must have missed something. So this baby is going to be severely deformed. There's not going to be any, there was months without oxygen. The baby's going to have some brain damage, just telling me all these horrible things that were going to happen to this baby. And I remember just looking at them and saying, no, God fixed my baby. There's nothing going to be wrong with this baby. And I had such joy for the first time in my life in so long. This overwhelming peace and joy just came over me. And I know it was God's affirmation that he did love me. My baby girl was born 2 weeks later, very healthy and very perfect on the APGARs, and had no problems at all with her in any regards. And I knew then that God loved me and that he took care of me on that bridge that day so that I could share my story with others who were going through the pain and sorrow that I was going through.
That is just the most incredible story. It moved me deeply the first time I heard it, even more so the second time. But, I have this question. Like you were going through such terrible experience, and there was no one who inquired, or checked on you or tried to help in any way. How does this happen, and how do we prevent this from happening? How do we recognize the signs of something like this happening in other person's life? It's a shame. I'm sure you lived in a place that was full of churches and even, the Catholic church that you attended, and no one tried to ask questions or do something about it. So, what is the answer to this?
I love that question, Helen. And I think on a couple of regards, I think, right, as church members and church body, a family, we have to check in on each other. We have to ask more than just, hi, how are you? What's going on? It can't be at this surface level, because I think if anybody would have ever pulled me aside and just asked a few more questions, they would have seen the pain or heard the pain. Even as a child, if any of the nuns, because I told you I went to Catholic school, I went to school with bruises many times. If any of them would have pulled me over and asked, how did that happen? What's going on in your world? I think that would have been a saving grace for me earlier on. In a high school, instead of my teachers hiding things from me, alcohol especially, he obviously knew I had a problem. He could have very well sent me. And the one that did try, she tried, but she couldn't. I didn't have no trust in adults at that time. I didn't know I could reach out to people. I didn't know they would take care of me. I only knew adults would either hurt you or neglect you, turn a deaf ear to what you were saying. So it didn't even make sense to even give her my story. So I think we have to pay attention to teens as well, when they are moody. And part of that is being a teen, and part of that is life changes, but part of that might be way deeper. And I think it's so important for youth groups and places for teens to gather to talk to each other, because I also did not have friends that I could trust or share anything with either. So I think some of those places for the church, I think, are very important. Know your people, know the children in your church, know the teenagers in your church, get to know them better, find out more about their families, help their families. And then I think that's what actually made me, like I said earlier, become a teacher, because I wanted to make sure kids had somebody to listen to them and to speak out for them. That's why I became a social worker and went into child welfare, so that I could be the voice for the children that were being abused and neglected, like myself, so that I could be there for the teenagers who needed an adult to say, hey, I care, and I'm not going to let you push me away, and we're going to work on this together. And then now I work with teen moms and older moms to remind them how important it is to pick up your babies, to love them, to nurture them, no matter what. And now I work with domestic violence survivors to help them understand that when they're being treated this way, it's not something they deserve, but it's the other person trying to control them. And prayer is so very important. So I think praying for the families in your church, always just asking God to show you what they need, is so very important.
And my last question is, what makes your testimony so powerful, that it wasn't another person that shared the reality of God with you, but God literally reached down and pulled you out of a very dark moment in your life? And so have you had a chance, as you're helping families or individuals in very deeply dark circumstances, to share that reality of Christ, who cares and loves, and had a lasting impact on them?
Absolutely. I've had opportunities to really share my story. A lot of times they don't believe that I've been through anything like what they've been through. And I've been able to share that, yes, I have been there. And the only way I got out of that was by trusting in God to be able to move the mountains that needed to be moved, because programs aren't going to do that. Nothing delivered me from alcohol except God. And that happened when I became pregnant the first time. God just took away the desire for alcohol, and I've never had a drink since. And my firstborn is 41 now. So I haven't had a drink in 41 years. He took the desire away. And when I'm working with people struggling with alcohol, I remind them the same thing. Programs are only helpful so much, but God himself can take the desire of the alcohol away from you. He can remove that and change your life forever. So without God, I've seen people struggle even harder, because they get only so far because that's all the man system. That's all I can do as a trained social worker. That's all I can do as a drug counselor. That's all I can do as a domestic violence counselor. But God is the next level who can do it all and change your life completely. So when they hear that, a lot of times, many of them have given their life to God, and God has done amazing things with them and their children and their lives. I pray still. Like I say, my parents have really become believers and strong believers. My dad has been delivered from alcohol. My mom has been delivered from alcohol. They are serving the Lord even today. And so to see God answer the prayer of a 4-year-old, yes, it took a long time to get there, but he answered the prayer of a 4-year-old. So I think, that is the most important thing. Without God, none of this is possible.
Even if you have not experienced abuse and violence like Colette, but feel alone, separated from God, or perhaps hopeless, I pray Colette's testimony is an encouragement to you today. It reveals the faithfulness of God to save us from our pain and destruction. In her dark moment, God reached down from heaven and spoke to Colette, expressed his love for her, and proved it at the same time. One of the most inspiring parts of her story is how Colette is now using her testimony to support other women and survivors of domestic abuse. Now that her life has been changed, she's using her experience to help change the lives of others. At World Missions Alliance, we believe that changed lives change lives. If you have a testimony of how God changed your life, you're equipped to be a life changer. I encourage you to learn more about what we do at World Missions Alliance by visiting our website, rfwma.org. Send us an email, share your story, and perhaps you discover your place in the Great Commission. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Limitless Spirit Podcast. Until next time, I'm Helen Todd.
Limitless Spirit Podcast is produced by World Missions Alliance. We believe that changed lives change lives. If you want to see your life transformed by Christ's love, or if you want to help those who are hurting and hopeless and discover your greater purpose in serving Christ through short-term missionary work, check out our website, rfwma.org, and find out how to get involved.